I have been considering for a while finding a broken down toy vehicle to rehabilitate to represent one of the types of vehicles I was trained to use during my time in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia over 45 years ago. I thought such a project could be done over 2 or 3 episodes and would be a good way to provide content for my YouTube channel, and in the end would leave me with a nice memento of my time in the Canadian Armed Forces. I served in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia from 1978 to 1982, first with the SALH and later the 15 Edmonton Service Battalion. Boy, is the equipment used by the SALH a lot better than I remember having back in 1978 and 79. After I left the militia in 1982, the SALH in the mid-1980s was equipped with lav-wheeled armored vehicles, such as the Cougar shown here, and used them until the lavs were retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2005. Presently, militia armored reconnaissance units, such as the SALH, use the German-designed J-Wagon, which is a military version of the Mercedes SUV, and the new TAPV wheeled armored recon vehicle that has all the computerized bells and whistles. But in my time back in the SALH in 1978 and 79, all we had was the good old quarter-ton Jeeps. We were mainly supplied with the M38 Jeep, which was built in 1952, and there were some more modern M151 Jeeps as well. The M151 had a nasty tendency to roll over if you went cross-country or steered over aggressively due to an oversensitive suspension system, and were the only Jeeps I remember in the armed forces with a roll cage due to this regrettable inclination. But it was the good old M38 Jeep that I used the most during my time in the militia, and that is the one I decided to copy for my project. I decided to go with an early G.I. Joe Jeep from the 1960s, built for the 12-inch action figures to form my project. Since I was going to make a number of modifications to the Jeep to make it conform to the Canadian Jeeps I remember from my service in the late 1970s and very early 1980s, I didn't want to use a nice G.I. Joe Jeep and possibly ruin it. So I went with one that was well loved by a little boy back in the day. And I think I hear it coming. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for dropping off the Jeep. I'll get it back to you guys as soon as I get it fixed up. Well, let's have a look at what we got. First up, the G.I. Joe Jeep is based on the World War II version of the Willys Jeep and not the M38. The most notable difference between the two is that the front fenders of the M38 mold up even to the opening for the doorways, whereas the Willys Jeep has a cutaway section for a small running board just before the doorway. So I had to decide, am I going to perform major surgery on my G.I. Joe Jeep to make the fenders line up like they do on the M38? Let's see. No! So my Jeep will be a homage to the Jeeps I remember, and not a 100% reproduction. Now that the G.I. Joe Jeep is here, I can tell you one thing, it's been well played with, which is a good thing. That's what toys are for, is for the little ones to have and have fun with. There's nothing sadder than a toy that's sitting in a box that's never been opened and nobody's ever played with it or had fun with it. So let's have a look, see what kind of condition it's in and what I'm going to need to make it right again. Okay, let's see what we're starting off with this G.I. Joe Jeep. Let's start with the front. Okay, the bumper's in pretty good condition, other than this square bit over here, which I think, in pictures I've seen of G.I. Joe Jeeps, they mounted on the logo for G.I. Joe or a little flag or something in there. But that's not a big worry. I might keep it, I might not. The hood's in good condition, other than a small chip right there, but that's nothing to worry about. And the headlights are in good condition. Well, I'm going to have to make sure I don't damage them while I'm doing my repair work. Moving on to the side. Okay, on the passenger side, there's pretty good condition, I would say. The thing missing, the main thing is that there's no windshield, so I'm going to have to order in a new windshield for this Jeep. Now, there's a mounting hole here. I think that was where they mounted the spare tire at one time. I'm going to mount it somewhere else on the rear, so I can always fill in that hole, sand it down, and I'm going to paint this Jeep anyway, so that doesn't present a problem. Over here, that hole I believe is for side marker lights and whatnot. I'll decide on what I'm going to do with that one when the time comes. I might either fill it in or I might use it to mount a side lights. Moving on to the rear. Main thing about the rear, there's no tailgate. When I was in the military, I don't ever remember these Jeeps having a tailgate. And if they did, I don't ever remember opening it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a piece of styrene and just fill it in as a solid piece, so it won't have an operating tailgate when I'm done. Another thing that's you can see on one side the bumper, but on this side the bumper is broken off, but I have an idea how I can fix that. Also, I'm going to put in a back seat in this, because I always remember these military Jeeps having a back seat, because it used to be a three-man crew: the driver, the commander, and the radio operator back here. Moving on to the driver's side, and one thing for sure, there's no steering wheel, and so I'm going to have to order one of them. Other than that, you can see the marking lights are still in place here. I'm not too thrilled about this gas cap arrangements, because what I remember being on the military Jeeps was different. It was recessed, so I might do something about that. Again, we got the hole for the missing windshield. But other than that, the Jeep's in not too bad a condition. So let's go and see about getting in some parts and some extra bits to add some details to make it more like a Canadian military Jeep. Repair parts for the old G.I. Joe Jeep are not the easiest thing to find. I was able to source parts on both eBay and Etsy, but at a considerable cost, mostly due to shipping. Also, some of the parts sold to me were made on a 3D printer and so are not genuine parts, but that's okay, as it is better to have a 3D part rather than no part at all. So over a period of about a month, in trickled the following: a windshield, a steering wheel, a back seat, and from a local hobby shop, all the styrene I'd need to get to work on the Jeep. I also sourced some of the weapons and a jerry can I remember being carried by these Jeeps on exercise. And finally, I even acquired a crew to man the Jeep when it is done. We'll get started on the G.I. Joe Jeep renovation with a little bit of disassembly. It's a lot easier later on when it comes time to do the painting if all these extra parts aren't on the Jeep. That way it's easier to mask what you need to mask and get the paint where you want it rather than on parts where you don't want it. We'll get started by taking off the wheels, which are held on by these top hat rivets that are a royal pain to take off. After quite a bit of work with the hacksaw getting the head of that rivet off, I was finally able to pry it off with a screwdriver. After that, you can take off the wheel. Inside you'll find a spacer on the axle. Pull the other tire to remove the axle. Again, you got a spacer of the behind the wheel. Then you have the axle. And you have a little brass bearing. That fits in the hubcap, which can be removed from the tire. There's another bearing on the other side of the tire. So I disassemble the wheels, making sure I don't lose anything. And to make sure I don't lose anything, I'm putting everything away in a tray. Since the headlights on this G.I. Joe Jeep are in good condition, I want to make sure they don't get damaged or get paint on them. And on the back side of the headlights, underneath the hood, you'll see that the headlight is held on by this little lock washer thing. It isn't on there very tight. The screwdriver pops it off, and out comes the headlight. Once you got the headlight off, you'll notice on the back that there's a real thin piece of paper with tin foil on one side to act as the reflector. It's real delicate, so you don't want to make sure you don't lose that. So I'm putting it back on. I'm putting its lock washer with it. I'm not putting it on fully. And I'm going to put it in the tray to keep it from getting lost. Okay, now that the disassembly is done, let's get started on doing some detail work, starting with the front of the Jeep. At the front, we're going to add a wire cutter. At the front of these Jeeps, you most often see a pole-like attachment to the bumper, the purpose of which was to cut barbed wire that was strung up by the enemy at neck height to ambush any Jeep that might come along. If the Jeep was going at any reasonable speed, and especially if the windshield was down, the crew ran the risk of serious injury, including most likely decapitation. On the pole were hooks located at the top of the pole and just above the hood height to catch and cut any barbed wire before it got to the crew. For the pole part, I'm just using a 1/4 inch angle stock, styrene angle stock. At the top, I'm going to cut a bit of a 45 degree angle because I noticed the top had a bit of a taper. And then I'm going to cut in a little bit of a slot underneath that. For the teeth, I rated my junk box, and on an old model kit thing, I found a number thing here, which was about the right shape. So I just broke that off, and that'll be the teeth for my wire cutter. On that part there, I just take a file and gently rub the number off it so that it's smooth. I bend it a little bit, then fit it into the slot, and I'll set it with a little bit of model airplane there. And there we go, we got our poles set with our top tooth already in place. To set the height of the pole, I figure the top tooth should be slightly above the height of his head. Any wire higher than that wouldn't cause a problem. Anything lower than that, and he still would be at risk of injury. So let's have a look here. I figure that's a good height. The height of the second tooth, after we set the pole in place, should be just above the hood. So right about there. To produce the second slot, we do a little bit of filing until we get a slot cut into the angle. Then we take our tooth and fit it through the slot. Set it at roughly the same angle as the top tooth, and then set it in place with a bit of model airplane glue. I filled the bottom part of the wire cutter with a bit of scrapped styrene to make it a little stronger and also make a flat surface to attach the mounting plate. Since unlike the real thing, this wire cutter's a bit delicate, I mounted it with nuts and bolts so that it can be easily removed if I ever decide to take this Jeep somewhere. Also, I went ahead and repaired that square mounting plate. I'll put something on it when it comes time to decorate it. Well, boys, you are now safe to head out down the road without the fear of losing your head to a strand of barbed wire. We will now turn our attention to the passenger side of the Jeep and the most distinctive feature on these little vehicles, the round recessed slave cable socket housing. Yes, I said slave cable, and no, it has nothing to do with enslaving human beings. A slave cable is the device designed and used by the various militaries around the world to boost vehicles when their battery goes dead. Rather than fumbling around under the hood with booster cables, making sure the positive and negative leads were attached to the proper posts on the battery on both vehicles, the military made the slave cable idiot-proof by making it so there was only one way the cable will fit into the slave cable socket. The positive pin on the cable will always go into the positive part of the socket, and the negative pin will always go into the negative part of the socket. By this design, the slave cable can be plugged into one vehicle and the other end of the cable can be plugged into another vehicle. And be sure everything is connected correctly. This makes it far easier for the less technically savvy among us to get things right. But far more important, this makes things faster and more efficient. A disabled vehicle is an easy target for the enemy, so the faster it can be started up, the better. Also at night, if you're fumbling around under the hood with a flashlight trying to hook up booster cables, you will give away your position to the enemy, and a disabled vehicle will be the least of your problems when he calls in an artillery or airstrike on your position. On the military Jeeps I used in the late 70s and very early 80s, there were three distinctive things on the slave cable socket housing I wanted to replicate. Number one, the recess housing area itself. Number two, the slave cable socket cover that is very visible. And the ring around the slave cable socket housing set into the body of the Jeep. When I was pondering how I was going to represent this, I took a drink from my water and noticed that the area where the cap is a recessed area, and at the bottom of it there's a ring that the cap rests against. So that would just work lovely. I got rid of this little bit of ring here, which was needed. Now I'll saw off the end of the bottle just behind the ring. A little bit of sanding, and the ring is nice and smooth, ready for installation. Now that we've got the recessed area where the slave cable socket is located, it's time to turn our attention to the slave cable cover that is visible in this recessed area. And for that, I found my aftershave cap was just the right shape. I cut the aftershave cap to length, set it in the bottle cap with a little screw, and there we are. One slave cable receptacle ready to go. I filmed drilling the hole in the Jeep for the slave cable recess off camera. If things went very, very wrong and the Jeep body either cracked severely or shattered, this YouTube video would never have been published. I'll just set the ring part in place, and the cap acts like a screw to help secure the slave cable ring in place. And there we go. One G.I. Joe Jeep body with a Canadian military slave cable socket installed. After I give the Jeep a thorough wash before painting, I'll glue the slave cable ring to the body. We will turn our attention now to the rear of the Jeep, starting with the missing bumper. First off, I take some measurements of the existing bumper. Then I transfer those measurements to a piece of scrap sheet aluminum I have. At my vise, I bend over the top and bottom edge of the new bumper to eliminate a sharp edge. At the drill press, I create a couple of holes for mounting screws to help position the bumper on the Jeep. Back at the vise, I make the final bends to the bumper to match as closely as I can the existing bumper. Using some super glue and some small machine screws, I attach the bumper to the Jeep. I overdid it with the super glue and it kind of squirted all over the place. There we go, the Jeep has a new bumper. It doesn't exactly match the old bumper, but it sure is a lot better than no bumper at all. Time to turn my attention to the gapping open area left by the missing tailgate by measuring up the gap and transferring the measurements to a piece of sheet styrene. I then cut out the material I needed and reinforced it with some styrene channel stock. Next, I glued styrene angle material around the edge of the opening to provide a surface to securely cement the panel material. I then determined where I wanted the spare tire to be located, drilled a hole and set a machine screw to mount the tire using a wing nut. Well, folks, I think this would be a good spot to end this first episode on my G.I. Joe Jeep rehab project. In the next episode, we will continue to repair and add detail parts to the Jeep to make it more closely resemble the Jeeps I used in the SALH 45 years ago. Till next time, everyone keep safe and well.